Montana Territory, 1879. The wind howled low across the prairie as if it knew what had just happened. They had thrown her from the wagon because she would not stop crying. Her voice had cracked from grief and the dust in her throat, and when she begged them, just begged them to slow down, to let her rest, the man driving the lead team said, "You want to sit in your sorrow, then sit in it alone." The wheels creaked on, leaving her there in the dirt with nothing but her satchel and the dull ache in her chest where her children used to be. 2 small graves lay a week behind her. She had not even been allowed time to bury them proper. The wagon line had a schedule and no patience for a mother's breaking heart. Her name was Vienna Mae Martin. She was 23, and she had nothing left but the clothes on her back and the sound of her own pain echoing across the plains. She did not know how long she sat there. The sun dropped lower. Her skirt stuck to her legs with sweat and dirt, and her lips cracked from thirst. She might have stayed until the coyotes came if not for the sound of hooves in the distance. The rider came from the west, a dark silhouette against the bloody sky. He rode without hurry but with purpose, like a man who had seen enough to know there was no sense in rushing unless someone was bleeding out. He slowed when he saw her. Pulled his horse to a stop just a few yards away. Vienna blinked up at him, too tired to stand. The wind tugged at her hair. She looked like a ghost already. The cowboy dismounted. He was tall, lean, with a dust-covered hat and shoulders that looked like they had carried more than saddlebags. His name, though she would not know it until later, was Maddox Jameson. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low and steady. She shook her head. "Just left behind." He looked down the empty wagon track. "They leave you on purpose," I cried, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "They said I was slowing them down, said I should be grateful they let me ride at all." His jaw clenched. He took a quiet breath, then offered her his canteen. She drank. It burned going down, but she kept drinking anyway. Once she handed it back, she stared at the ground. Her voice came out small. "I buried my children 7 days ago, a fever, both of them. They were 5 and 3. He did not say he was sorry. He just sat down in the dirt beside her, hat in his hands. "I do not know what to do," she whispered. "Then sit a while," he said. "I can hold you if you want." Her breath caught. She turned to him, eyes wide, tears welling up again, not from pain this time, but from the shock of someone seeing her. Someone offering something without expecting anything back. She nodded, barely. He opened his arms, and she leaned into him like she had not leaned into anyone in years. His coat smelled like horse and dust and something warm. He wrapped his arms around her without hesitation, slow and sure, like he meant it. She cried again, but quieter this time. The kind of crying that came from relief. They sat there until the sun dipped below the hills. Then Maddox stood and held out his hand. "I have a camp a mile back. You can rest there, safe." Vienna hesitated. "You do not have to help me, I know," he said, "but I am going to." He helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. She sat stiff at first, unsure of how to carry herself. But as the horse moved beneath them and the sky turned navy above, she let her shoulder rest against his chest. Maddox's camp was tidy, with a fire already built and a blanket rolled out beneath a tree. He gave her space, offered her his bedroll, and made a pot of coffee like it was just another evening. She stared at the flames, hands wrapped around the tin cup he gave her. "Why are you out here alone?" she asked. He stirred the fire with a stick. "Work dried up down near Laramie. Was headed toward Deer Lodge, heard a ranch might be hiring." "What about you?" "My husband died last winter," she said. "We were trying to make it to Washington Territory. I thought maybe things would be better there." "I reckon you thought wrong," he said gently. She nodded. They were quiet a long time. Later, when the fire died down and the stars came out hard and cold, Maddox looked over at her. She was curled beneath his blanket, eyes open. "You are safe," he said, "I know. You do not have to stay if you do not want to." "I do," she said. He nodded once. That night she slept without waking. For the first time in weeks, she did not dream of graves. She only dreamed of warmth and steady arms and a quiet voice saying, "I will hold you if you want." When morning came, Maddox was already up, boiling water and feeding his horse. Vienna sat up slowly, stretching beneath the blanket. He looked over his shoulder and smiled just a little. "You sleep all right," she nodded. He poured her coffee. They ate together without saying much, but something had shifted. She watched the way he moved, calm, capable, like a man who knew how to survive but had not forgotten how to be kind. After breakfast, he packed up camp. "I am still headed north," he said. "Could drop you in the next town, or you could ride with me." Vienna stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. She looked at him, really looked at him. "I will ride with you," she said. He gave a small nod, but his eyes warmed. They mounted up, and the trail stretched out before them. No promises were made, but something quiet had taken root between them. And as they rode side by side, her grief still heavy but not unbearable, she found herself glancing at him when he was not looking. And when their hands brushed on the reins, neither of them pulled away. They crossed into the Judith Basin 4 days later, the grass rising higher and greener with the spring thaw. Snow still clung to the distant peaks, but the air had softened. Birdsong threaded through the breeze, and the ground no longer crunched underfoot. Vienna's boots had blistered from walking when the horse needed a rest, but she bore it without complaint. Maddox offered to carry her once, and she'd refused with a quiet, "I can manage," and he hadn't asked again. One evening, they came upon a creek swollen with meltwater, the crossing too fast for a single horse with 2 riders. Maddox dismounted and studied the current, then looked back at her. "I'll take the saddlebags first, then come back for you." "Water's colder than it looks, don't try stepping in." Vienna nodded, arms folded against the sharp wind that rolled off the water. She watched as he guided the horse across, boots slipping on the river stones, then turned back, water soaking his trousers to the thigh. When he reached her again, he held out his hand. She took it, and he led her slowly into the water. Her skirts dragged heavy in the current, but he kept a firm grip on her waist. Halfway through, she stumbled, and he caught her with both arms, holding her tight until she found her footing again. Once they reached the other side, she stood dripping, breathless, her fingers still curled into his coat. She looked up at him, eyes wide. "There now," he said, voice low. "You're all right." Her jaw trembled, but she nodded. "I didn't think I'd be scared of water. Fear catches us where we're already hurt." She didn't reply, but she didn't let go of his coat right away either. They made camp beneath a cottonwood that night, the fire low and the stars caught in the branches above. Vienna sat with her feet bare, drying beside the flames. Maddox rolled a cigarette, struck a match against his belt buckle, and lit it with a steady hand. "You ever been this far north?" he asked. She rubbed her ankle. "Not past Nebraska before this trip," he nodded. "Folks are quieter out here. Less talk, more doing. I could get used to that." He leaned back against his saddle, watching her without staring. "What did you do before?" She hesitated. "Sewed for a dry goods store, helped my husband with his traps when I could. We were in Kansas near the Cottonwood River. Good trapping country, it was." Her voice thinned. "Until it wasn't." They sat in silence a while, the fire snapping softly. Then she laid back on the blanket, arms folded behind her head, and looked up through the branches. "You married?" she asked. "No." "Ever?" "No." She turned her head. "Why not?" Maddox tapped ash from the cigarette. "Didn't have anyone who asked me to stay." Vienna considered that. "What would make you stay?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Someone who looks me in the eye when I speak, who doesn't flinch when I get quiet." She let that settle between them. "You have that look about you," she said softly. "What look?" "Like someone who's had to carry too much alone." He watched the fire burn down into coals. "Maybe. But I ain't the only one." She didn't say anything more. The wind brushed through the leaves, and somewhere in the dark, a night bird called. When she finally fell asleep, Maddox sat up a while longer, the firelight painting his face in bronze and shadow. The next morning, they shared cornbread he had wrapped in oiled cloth, the edges still soft. He handed her the larger piece without comment, and she took it with a quiet nod. Around midday, they passed a small homestead with cows grazing near a split rail fence. A woman waved from the porch and Maddox tipped his hat. Vienna watched the children chasing each other near the barn, a flicker of something unreadable in her face. She didn't speak for miles. Then, as they crested a rise and the valley opened wide below, she said, "I don't know how to be around children anymore. You don't have to." "But I used to love them," she murmured. "I used to feel alive when they laughed." He glanced over. "You ever think about teaching?" She blinked. "Like a school teacher? There's towns up near Fort Benton that need them, not enough folks with letters. I never went past readers myself, still more than most." She looked away, thoughtful. They made camp early that night near a shallow bluff where the wind was blocked. Maddox gathered firewood while Vienna washed her hands in a nearby spring, the water cold and clear. When she returned, he was coaxing flame from flint and steel. She knelt beside him, not saying anything. After the fire caught, she touched his arm lightly. "Thank you for waiting that day. If you hadn't come by," he didn't move, "you'd have made it, might have just taken longer." "I don't think I would have tried." Maddox set down the flint, turning toward her. "Then I'm glad I came when I did." They were quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of strangers. That night she laid her blanket a little closer to his. Not touching, but near enough that their breathing almost matched. And when she turned onto her side and whispered, "Good night," he answered with, "Sleep easy, Vienna," as though he'd known her name his whole life. By the time they reached the edge of the highwood foothills, the days had grown longer. The light lingered over the ridges like it didn't want to leave, and the earth smelled of thawed grass and pine resin. Vienna had taken to guiding the horse by herself when the trail was wide and even. Maddox rode beside her, his hands easy at the reins, but his eyes always scanning the tree line. They made camp that evening beneath a slope scattered with old lodgepole pines. Maddox had found a coyote trail that led to a spring-fed pool, and Vienna had gathered kindling with a quiet focus. They worked in rhythm now, wordlessly dividing the tasks between them without needing to ask. Later, as the fire settled into a steady glow, Vienna sat with her palms near the heat. A moth circled the flame, wings catching the light. Maddox leaned back on one elbow, watching her. "You ever think about where you'd stop if you could?" She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think about a house with a roof that doesn't leak, a porch with a place to sit. Somewhere not too far from trees, but close enough to a road that someone might pass by now and then." He nodded once. "Close to water, always." He was quiet, then said, "I've got a claim about 8 miles west of here, old trapper's cabin on it, roof sound. Spring runs through the corner of the land." Her gaze lifted to him slowly. "Why aren't you living there?" Set it aside. "Figured I'd know when it was time." A log popped in the fire, sending sparks drifting. Vienna didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved over the dark shapes of the hills. "You think you'll go back to it now?" "I might," he said. "If I had reason." She looked at her hands, the cuts healing over her knuckles, the dirt beneath her nails. "I'd like to see it." Maddox didn't move. "You could." Something settled between them, solid and real, not a promise, but the shape of one, forming slow and unspoken. That night she laid down closer than before. When the wind picked up and the fire burned low, she shifted beneath the blanket and whispered, "Can I?" He opened his arm without a word, and she tucked herself against his side. They didn't speak again. The sound of her breath evened out against his chest, and he stayed awake a while, not from worry, but to memorize the weight of her there. The next morning, he saddled the horse while she laced her boots. Her hair was still damp from the spring where she'd washed it, and the early light made it shine like wheat. She walked over with a steady step. "How far to your place?" she asked. "Half a day." She mounted without needing help. He watched her settle the reins, then swung up beside her. They rode west, cutting across a narrow trail that curved beneath the ridgeline. In the silence, Vienna said, "You always this quiet with people?" "Only the ones I mean to keep." Her brow lifted, but she didn't tease him. Instead, she reached for the edge of his sleeve and brushed it lightly with her fingers. By midday, they turned off the main trail and passed through a stand of old birch, the bark pale and peeling. A small fence, half fallen, marked the edge of a clearing. The cabin stood beyond it, rough-hewn but straight, with a stone chimney and a door that hung square on its hinges. A barn leaned against the rise, and a line of fence posts marked a pasture gone wild. Vienna dismounted slowly, eyes wide. Maddox watched her take it in, hands loose at his sides. "It needs work." She stepped toward the porch and ran her fingers over the rail. "It's dry and quiet." He joined her, not too close. "Used to keep a goat here. Coyotes got her." She smiled faintly. "I'm better with thread than fences. I got the fences." They stood there a long moment. Then she said, "I don't want to be beholden, not if I stay." "You wouldn't be," he said. "You'd be wanted." Her breath caught just slightly, then she nodded. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and old smoke. Dust floated in the shafts of light that came through the chinks in the logs. She set her satchel on the table and looked around slowly at the iron stove, the narrow bed, the shelf of tins and jars. Maddox leaned against the doorframe, watching her not like a man expecting thanks, but like one waiting for a truth to settle. Vienna turned to him. "Would you mind if I mended the curtains?" He smiled then, slow and full of something deep. "I'd be grateful." She unwrapped her sewing kit from her satchel and sat at the table, fingers already threading the needle. Maddox stepped outside to split wood, the sound of the axe rising in steady rhythm. The sun dipped lower, casting gold through the window. Vienna sewed by that light, the fabric steady in her hands, and when evening came she stepped out onto the porch as he stacked the last of the wood. He straightened when he saw her, sweated his collar, hands rough from work. "I'll stay," she said, voice sure. He didn't move toward her. He waited. Vienna took the last step herself, standing in front of him. "Not just for tonight, for good." Maddox reached up and cupped her cheek, gentle. "Then this is your place now, too." She leaned into his touch, eyes wet but smiling, and when he kissed her, it was quiet and certain, like everything they'd built from that first moment in the dust had led here. That night they lay beneath the roof he'd built, wrapped in warmth that wasn't just fire or blankets, but something earned, something whole. And when sleep came, it came soft and without grief. A week passed in the quiet rhythm of shared labor and wordless understanding. Vienna had scrubbed the cabin clean, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water, but the place had begun to feel like it breathed again. Maddox repaired the barn roof and cleared the pasture fence, working with the kind of steadiness that didn't ask for praise. One afternoon, she found a rusted kettle near the back of the cupboard and set it on the wood stove, heating snowmelt for washing. Maddox came in from the shed, shaking sawdust from his coat. "You always move this quick on a place?" he asked, stepping out of his boots. "I reckon it's easier to keep going than sit still," she said, wringing out a linen cloth. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You ever think about painting the door?" She looked at it gray from weather, the wood dry as old bone. "If I had color, I would. I'll see about hauling some from town next week," he said. "They got a store in Belt with barrels of blue and ochre." Vienna hung the cloth by the fire, her brow lifting. "You plan to go alone. Didn't figure you'd care for the ride." "I didn't say that." He watched her a long moment. "It's a 2-day trip there and back. Rough trail, I've done worse." A pause passed between them, not heavy but sure. Then he said we could take the wagon. "Camp by the creek just east of Arrow Ridge." She nodded once. "I'd like that." They left the next morning with a crate of cured meat, a wool blanket, and a battered lantern swinging from the sideboard. Maddox drove the team while Vienna sat beside him, hands in her lap, watching the sky shift from pale gray to clear blue. They passed a burned-out homestead before noon. Vienna turned her face away, but Maddox reached across the seat and rested a hand on her arm. She didn't speak, but she didn't move away either. They made camp where the cottonwoods leaned over the creek bank, their roots exposed like rib cages. Vienna gathered dry moss and blew gently on the tinder Maddox had set. When the fire caught, she sat back on her heels and said, "My father used to fish these little creeks. He'd whistle to the water like it was listening." Maddox placed the skillet over the flames. My brother used to do that. Claimed trout liked turkey in the straw. You still ride him. His shoulders shifted. He died near Shiloh, never came back, she nodded. Mine didn't either. Horse threw him when I was 15. They didn't carry the conversation further. Some memories needed only to be named once. That night, they lay side by side beneath the canvas tarp stretched from the wagon. Vienna curled toward him, her breath warmed by the nearness of his chest. "Do you ever miss drifting?" she asked. "I miss it less each day." She pulled the blanket higher over them. "I'm not used to feeling steady." "You don't have to be used to it," he said. "You just have to let it come." The next day, the trail narrowed between two basalt ridges, and the wagon wheels caught twice on buried stone. Maddox climbed down, studied the ruts, and motioned for Vienna to take the reins. "Easy now," he said. "Ease your right hand when the left dips." She guided the horses through, her grip sure, her face calm. When they cleared the pass, Maddox looked up at her and smiled. "You drive like you were born to. I never had the chance before." They reached Belt before sundown. The town sat low in the basin, its roofs patched with tin and moss. Vienna walked with Maddox to the dry goods store, the hem of her skirt brushing the plank walk. Inside, she paused beside a barrel of seed potatoes while Maddox bartered for flour and lamp oil. The shopkeeper, a round man with a crooked vest, eyed her carefully. "She your wife?" he asked, counting out nails into a tin scoop. Maddox didn't look up. "She's mine." Vienna turned slightly, not startled, but still. When the man nodded and turned away, she met Maddox's eyes. "You didn't flinch," she said later as they loaded the wagon. "Didn't see the need." They drove back through the basin with the sun low behind them, the horses' ears twitching at flies. Vienna held a small tin of blue paint in her lap, her thumb resting against the lid. When they reached the cabin again, it stood as they'd left it quiet, waiting. Vienna stepped from the wagon and looked toward the door. "I'll paint it tomorrow." Maddox carried the sack of flour up the steps. "I'll be here." That night after supper, she took her sewing outside and sat on the porch while he checked the barn. The stars came out in ones and twos, then all at once, when he returned, she looked up from the hem she was mending. "I used to think love was something that came all at once, like a fever." He sat beside her, hands resting on his knees. "And now I think it's something you build. One nail at a time." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for her hand and she let him. They sat like that until the chill rose off the grass and the lantern inside burned down to a flicker. Then she stood and pulled him gently to his feet. Inside, she folded the mending and placed it on the shelf. Maddox took off his boots, his movements slow. Vienna turned toward him at the edge of the bed. "I'm not afraid of this," she said. "I know," he answered. She reached for his hand again, and this time she didn't let go. The door was blue now. A deep, steady shade that caught the light just after sunrise, the kind of color that didn't shout but stayed with you. Vienna had painted it in the still hours before dawn, when the mist rolled low and the world held its breath. Maddox hadn't said anything when he saw it, just ran a hand along the frame and nodded once, as though something had finally claimed its place. The days grew warmer. Snowmelt fed the creek in a steady hush, and the pasture grasses pushed up green and thick. Vienna mended a saddle blanket that had frayed at the edges. Maddox built a new chicken pen with timber from the ridge, sawn clean and notched tight. They moved through the days like two people who'd come to understand the value of silence and the comfort of doing beside one another. One morning, she found him in the field, crouched beside a fence post where the wire had come loose. He looked up when she approached, forehead shaded by the brim of his hat. "There's a boy in town with draft mares for sale," he said. "Might be more use than the geldings we've got." Vienna folded her arms. "How many hands?" 15, maybe a bit more. Calm-eyed, he said they're good under harness. "Then we should go." He stood slowly, brushing his palms against his trousers. "You really mean it, don't you?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." They rode into Belt again that week, but this time on their own wagon, the wheels greased and the canvas tied clean. Maddox bartered the old plow for a better harness. and Vienna traded 2 of her sewn aprons for a bolt of calico and a ceramic basin. They spoke less in town than they did at home, but their eyes found each other often, quiet glances that said more than a dozen words ever could. The mares were as promised broad-shouldered and steady, the kind of animals that didn't spook at wind or wagons. Maddox walked the fence of the pen with Vienna beside him, and when the boy asked who'd be handling the reins, she said, "We both will." They made the trade and left town with dust on their boots and new weight in the wagon. On the way back, Maddox handed her the reins without a word. She guided the mares along the narrow trail like it was something she'd done her whole life. That night, he brought in a pail of water from the spring while she stirred cornmeal for supper. The wood stove popped and settled as it cooled. "You ever think about what comes after?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up from the pan. "After what? After we get everything in order, the land cleared, the barn mended, a routine set." Vienna wiped her hands on her apron. "I think about a table big enough for company. I think about planting something that takes more than one season to come up." Maddox stepped inside, his boots quiet against the floorboards. "I think about building onto this place, a room with windows on every side." "For sewing?" she asked. "For whatever you want," he said. Then, after a pause, maybe a cradle, her breath caught not sharp but slow and full. "You'd want that?" "I'd want what you want." She stepped toward him, the distance between them narrowing like it always did when the right words found their way. "Then I want to be your wife." Maddox's voice was low. "Here or with a preacher?" "Here," she said. "Right here. With the blue door and the wind in the grass and your hands steady on mine." He took her face in his hands then, as though he'd been waiting to be sure, and kissed her like it was something that had been promised long before either of them had spoken it aloud. They were married 3 days later, beside the creek where the cottonwoods leaned. Maddox carved their initials into the bark of one, just above where her fingers could reach. He wore a clean shirt. She wore a dress she'd let out at the seams and stitched back tight with thread she'd saved since Kansas. No one else stood with them, but they didn't need anyone. They said their vows with river water at their ankles and sunlight on their shoulders, and when Maddox said her name after the last words were spoken, it came out like a prayer. The seasons turned. Spring bled into summer, and their land grew thick with wildflowers and bees. Vienna planted beans and squash in rows behind the cabin, and Maddox built a second chicken coop after the first filled quicker than they expected. They taught each other small things: how to read weather by the wind's pitch, how to tell when a horse was favoring a hoof, how to shape a loaf without wasting flour. She started keeping a ledger, recording what they had, what they needed, and what they could trade for. In the margins, she sometimes wrote small notes: "Maddox saw a fox near the ridge," or "Rain came early, and we danced in it." In the fall, she took a pen and wrote one other line, her hand shaking just enough to make the ink pool at the edge of the letter: "Child coming." Late spring. When she showed him, he didn't say anything for a long time, just pressed his hand over hers where the ink had dried and kissed the top of her head, his breath warm in her hair. They built the cradle together from pine. He carved soft edges into it, and she lined it with ticking and quilted cloth. The cabin smelled of wood shavings and dried herbs, and the fire never ran low. Winter came, but the cold didn't reach them like it had the year before. Their home was full now of breath, of laughter, of something tender that didn't need speaking. And when the snow fell thick and slow outside the blue door, Maddox laid another log on the fire, and Vienna leaned into him, her hand resting on the small curve of her belly. They stayed like that, the hush around them warm and whole, and the world outside could do what it liked. They had everything they needed, and everything they'd built together.